What if the scariest things in the wilderness aren't the ones we already know? There are places in the world where something watches from the shadows, waiting. Hikers vanish without a trace. Campers flee in terror, leaving everything behind. Survivors return, but their stories don't make sense. Whispers of massive figures, unnatural growls, and eerie footprints too large for any known animal. Authorities blame bears, jaguars, or tragic accidents, but the details never quite add up. From the misty peaks of Ireland to the dense forests of Japan, encounters like these share one chilling truth: something was out there, and it wasn't human. If you think you're safe in the wilderness, these stories may change your mind. On August 14, 2011, 5 college students from Western Ridge University arrived at Timberline Woods in Oregon for a weekend trip. They were led by Daniel Clark, a 21-year-old biology major who had grown up hiking and camping in the region. With him were his friends Lucas Reed, Jenny Morris, Tanya Hill, and Brandon Keller. The group had planned this backcountry trip for weeks, wanting to explore the quieter trails near Little Butte Creek. They brought tents, food supplies, cameras, and a GPS tracker to record their route for a small nature documentary project. Daniel was excited to lead the trip. He had been to Timberline Woods before and knew the importance of being prepared. Everyone carried bear spray and a first aid kit. The group left their cars at a trailhead and hiked several miles into the forest, finally setting up camp near the creek. It was peaceful, the kind of place they had been hoping for: remote, quiet, and untouched. That night, they lit a small fire, reviewed some of their camera footage, and planned the next day's hike. The mood was calm. Around midnight, the group recorded one last video clip before turning off their gear and crawling into their tents. Nothing seemed unusual at that time. At 2:36 a.m., the emergency radio at the ranger station picked up a panicked transmission from Daniel's group. Screaming voices were heard, and one sentence stood out clearly: "It's huge. It's not a bear." Then the line went dead. Rescue teams were sent out the next morning. It took hours to reach the campsite due to rough terrain. When they arrived, what they found was deeply disturbing. The tents were torn apart, slashed in multiple directions. Supplies were scattered in the dirt. Blood marked the grass and nearby rocks. Giant footprints, larger than anything known in the area, circled the camp. The team quickly searched the area and eventually found Daniel Clark half a mile from the campsite. He was lying near a fallen tree, shaking and barely able to speak. He was severely dehydrated and in shock, but had no major physical injuries. He was carried out of the forest and taken to the hospital. Back at the scene, searchers continued looking for the others. No other members of the group were found alive. Only blood trails and shredded clothing remained. Forensic teams confirmed signs of a violent encounter, but no bear was spotted nearby. The authorities stated that the group had likely been attacked by a grizzly bear. Though the large size of the prints and unusual destruction at the site raised many questions, park rangers found no grizzly activity in the area before or after the event. Daniel, once stable, shared a very different story. He said the creature was not a bear. He claimed it stood taller than any human, moved without sound, and chased them through the trees. His account was dismissed as trauma-induced confusion, but even years later, people still wonder what really happened in the forest that night. Daniel Clark remained in the hospital for several days. He had no broken bones, but doctors noted signs of extreme stress. He was found shaking, unable to recall how he ended up alone and far from the camp. His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, and he avoided talking about the events in the forest for hours. Only after calming down did he begin to speak slowly, describing something no one could understand. He said it moved like wind, but stood taller than a man. It circled them without sound. He described glowing eyes and shadows that seemed to walk on 2 legs, but never left normal footprints. Officials dismissed these claims, writing them off as fear and confusion. But the rescue team who saw the scene had doubts. They had never seen a grizzly leave such destruction. The tents were shredded from high angles, some cut cleanly across the top, and heavy gear had been thrown far from the camp. Daniel's friends, Lucas, Jenny, Tanya, and Brandon, were never found. Only blood smears, torn clothing, and drag marks leading into the dense woods remained. No wildlife, not even bears, was detected nearby in the days that followed. Rangers set up motion sensors and hidden cameras, hoping to capture anything unusual, but nothing appeared. The area was closed off for weeks. People began talking. Some locals believed it was a bear attack. Others whispered about old stories of strange creatures in Timberline Woods. Online, a rumor grew that the students had been filming something when it attacked. Some said SD cards may have survived, but none were recovered. A few frames from the group's earlier footage were released by Daniel, showing them laughing, hiking, and cooking. But there was no video from the night they vanished. Authorities released a final report stating that the group likely startled a bear and was attacked in the dark. But not everyone believed that. A ranger who had helped in the search quietly told others that the tracks found near the camp were too wide, too deep, and moved in a strange pattern. Nothing matched normal wildlife behavior. Daniel returned to his home after weeks of recovery. He dropped out of college and rarely left his house. He said he often woke at night sweating, hearing the same heavy breathing that had surrounded their tents. Friends noticed that he kept his lights on even during the day. He never went near the woods again. In the months that followed, investigators revisited the site multiple times. New soil samples were taken, and the area was mapped with drones. But no evidence pointed clearly to any known predator. There were no signs of bears, mountain lions, or wolves in the region during that time. The cameras left behind by rangers captured only quiet trees and shifting fog. Eventually, the forest reopened, and hikers returned to nearby trails. But few wandered as deep as Daniel's group had. The memory of what had happened lingered in the town near Timberline Woods, where residents spoke cautiously about that weekend. Some believed Daniel, others did not, but no one could explain what left such damage or how it happened so quickly. The trail where it occurred was renamed and removed from official maps. Rangers avoided questions and pointed to the official statement. But those who had seen the scene, who had walked through the silent, torn-up camp, knew something different had happened. Not an accident, not a bear, something else. The forest slowly returned to silence. Trees grew back over the camp area. New hikers passed nearby without knowing what happened there. But the locals remembered. They said something old lived deep in the trees, something not yet understood. Daniel's story faded over time, but the search logs, footprints, and remains told a darker truth. What happened in Timberline Woods that night may never be known, but Daniel never changed his story. He believed they were being hunted, not by a bear, but by something else. On March 22, 1999, two young men stepped into the dense green edge of Nishikimori Forest, a stretch of wilderness located in northern Honshu. Kenji Takamura, age 24, and Hiroshi Yamamoto, age 25, had traveled from Tokyo with cameras, batteries, and sleeping bags. They were urban explorers, fascinated by abandoned places, dark history, and stories of the supernatural. For months, they had talked about filming a horror documentary deep in Nishikimori, a forest long associated with legends and mystery. Kenji had a background in film production, while Hiroshi worked in freelance photography. Together, they had made small documentaries about tunnels, abandoned hospitals, and ruins around Japan. This time, they wanted to create something darker, something that connected with the forest's eerie reputation. They aimed to spend just one night near the lava tubes, far off the usual tourist paths, to film sounds, shadows, and whatever they could find. They parked their car at a small lot near the forest edge around noon. Their backpacks were packed with food, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and 2 handheld cameras. It was a clear afternoon, but the deeper they walked into the trees, the dimmer the light became. The thick canopy blocked most sunlight, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of their steps. They hiked for hours, following an old trail marked with faded ribbons. Kenji later said they reached a lava tube entrance around sunset and set up their small tent beside it. As night fell, the forest grew colder and darker than they had expected. Their cameras recorded strange sounds, snapping branches, distant growls, and wind that seemed to stop suddenly. Around midnight, Kenji believed something was watching them. He said the air felt heavier. Their flashlights caught a shape behind the trees, something tall that moved when they looked away. They tried to leave, but the forest around them no longer looked the same. Landmarks were missing, and the trail was gone. Not long after, Kenji claimed a figure stepped into view standing far off in the trees. He described it as tall, wide-shouldered, and covered in long black fur. He and Hiroshi ran in opposite directions. Kenji tripped and rolled down a slope, hitting rocks and branches. He suffered a broken arm, cuts along his ribs, and deep bruises. From below, he heard Hiroshi scream once, then nothing more. Kenji crawled out of the woods at sunrise, badly hurt and in shock. A hiker found him hours later and brought him to a hospital. Hiroshi was never found. Kenji told police what he saw. Authorities searched the forest and said Hiroshi likely fell into a lava tube. But that did not explain the large footprints near the camp or the strands of the black hair found hanging from a low branch. Police searched for 3 full days after Kenji was rescued from Nishikimori Forest. Trained teams moved through the brush with dogs and drones. Lava tubes were explored with ropes and lights. No body was found. What they did recover were pieces of camera gear, torn fabric, and footprints that seemed larger than human. They also collected several thick, dark strands of hair that did not match any native species. Wildlife experts could not confirm where the hair came from. Kenji stayed in the hospital under care for nearly 2 weeks. His injuries were treated, including his broken arm and deep cuts on his back and side. Doctors said he was lucky to be alive, considering the rough terrain he had crawled through. His condition improved physically, but mentally, he remained distant. He spoke only when asked, and refused to watch television or read. When people mentioned Hiroshi, he would go silent. Kenji finally gave a full report to the authorities. He described the creature again, insisting it was not a bear. He said its height, posture, and movement did not match anything he had seen before. He said it stalked them in silence and waited for the moment they were separated. Officials thanked him, but closed the investigation as an accident caused by falling or exposure. Kenji's camera was never found, but his small backpack was recovered near the slope where he had fallen. Inside it were batteries, a flashlight, and some personal items. Investigators could not find any new footage or images related to the night of the incident. After his release, Kenji moved away from Tokyo. He left his film work and stayed out of the public eye. He never returned to the forest. Internet forums picked up the story weeks later. Rumors spread that the two were filming something more than a horror documentary. Cryptid hunters became interested when the strange hair samples were discussed by local researchers. Some believed it was proof of a hidden species. Others thought it was staged. Kenji refused all media requests, but he shared one short message online through a private blog, saying only that what he saw was real, and it is still out there. He never posted again. What happened to Hiroshi remains a mystery. Some think he fell into one of the forest's lava tubes, as police claimed. Others believe he was taken by something unknown. The forest grew quiet again after the search ended, but hikers occasionally reported strange noises, deep footprints, and odd feelings of being watched. The story of the two urban explorers never left local legend. It joined the many dark tales whispered about Nishikimori Forest. But this time, there was a witness, one who survived with wounds and memories he would never forget. On November 3, 1984, 3 longtime friends, Jiri Novak, Thomas Kral, and Pavel Rada, set off into the thick woods of the Dupovska Hory, near the Czech-Germany border. The forest stretched for miles, covered in tall spruce trees and winding trails. Locals knew the area well, but it was easy to get lost if one strayed too far. That weekend, the weather was colder than usual. A gray mist hung low between the trees and frost glazed the fallen leaves. Jiri was a forestry student from Prague, who often spent his breaks exploring the outdoors. He had a quiet nature and a sharp eye for wildlife. Tomas was the oldest of the 3, working as a mechanic in a nearby village. He brought the supplies and had experience with hunting rifles. Pavel, the youngest, was an apprentice butcher who had never been deep into the forest before. This trip was meant to be a break from routine, a chance to reconnect and spend time away from the noise of the city. They set up camp near a narrow creek and cooked a simple meal over a fire. All seemed peaceful. Later, they split up briefly to scout for deer tracks, agreeing to meet back before sunset. The forest was still and quiet. Only the sound of crows echoed through the trees. As darkness began to fall, a strange tension settled over the woods. Tomas and Pavel made it back to camp, but Jiri did not return. They waited, calling his name, thinking he had lost his way. But the silence deepened. Hours passed, and the fire burned low. That night, both men claimed they heard noises outside the camp, crunching steps, low growls, and something brushing against the tents. They remained inside, holding their rifles, frozen with fear. By morning, the 2 men looked shaken. Their boots were muddy, and they had blood on their hands, not from a kill, but from clawing through brambles in search of Jiri. They eventually wandered out of the woods barefoot and confused, found by a ranger several miles from their original campsite. When authorities reached the area later that day, they found a torn jacket beside the creek, and Jiri's rifle bent and tossed aside. His body lay broken in the water, limbs at odd angles, as if thrown there with great force. Large footprints circled the camp, pressed deep into the soil. No tusk marks were found, only long scratches on the trees and rocks nearby. Rangers suggested a wild boar attack, but doubts lingered. Pavel, still in shock, spoke only a few words. He described something tall, almost man-shaped, moving through the fog. Thomas refused to talk. They were taken to a hospital for treatment, but their condition remained unstable for days. Villagers nearby whispered about Divokak Mus, the wild boar man, an old legend passed down through generations. They said it was no animal, something ancient, watching from the forest's edge. Authorities moved quickly once the surviving men were brought out of the forest. News of the incident reached the local police station, but few details were shared with the public. Investigators entered the forest with rangers, stepping carefully over frozen leaves and broken brush. They reached the creek where the camp had once been. Shredded tents lay scattered. A backpack had been torn open, its contents soaked from the cold ground. They found Jiri's body face down in the water, with bones visibly broken. There were no signs of bite wounds or tusk injuries, just blunt trauma and unnatural twists in his limbs. His body looked like it had been thrown rather than dragged. Blood stained the rocks nearby, but no trail led away from the scene. Only deep footprints, larger than any animal native to the area, pressed through patches of moss and mud. The tracks circled the area, then vanished into dense undergrowth. Thomas remained silent even days later. He refused to explain what had happened. He lay in a hospital bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, barely moving. Doctors described his condition as physical exhaustion, mixed with deep psychological distress. Pavel slowly recovered, though his words were scattered and unclear. He spoke of fog that would not lift, of a tall figure with long arms, and a sound like heavy breathing from behind the trees. He kept repeating the same line, saying it was watching them before it moved. Officials released a brief statement, saying that a wild boar stampede had caused the death, but locals questioned that explanation. They knew boars left clear signs, sharp tusk wounds, tracks in clusters, and charging paths. None of that was found at the scene. Hunters in the region had never seen anything like the prints recovered near the creek. Rumors spread fast through small villages along the border. In taverns and stores, old stories returned. People spoke again of the wild boar man, a spirit of the forest that punished those who crossed into forbidden paths. Some remembered old warnings from grandparents, telling children not to wander too deep into the woods during certain times of year. They believed the fog brought it out, and once it chose someone, there was no escape. The government never reopened the case. The area was left alone. Trees grew over the disturbed ground, and no new hunting permits were granted for months. Researchers who visited the location later said the forest had a strange silence, as if something unseen remained there. Only 2 people survived, and one was never the same again. Tomas left the village and was never heard from again. Pavel moved to the city far from any forest, and refused to speak of the event in public. Jiri was buried quietly, his funeral attended by a small group of family and students from the university. Years passed, but the story remained. Sometimes, hikers found animal bones near that same creek, placed in strange patterns. Some claimed to hear low growls at night when mist covered the trees. No proof was ever recorded, but those who knew the woods believed something was still out there, waiting. On January 8, 2007, a group of 5 British backpackers set out on a guided hike through the mist-covered trails of Verdantra Cloud Forest in the highlands of Costa Rica. The group had met at a hostel in San Ramon and decided to join a night hike through the famous forest preserve, known for its towering trees, low-hanging fog, and rare wildlife. Their guide was Marco Alvarado, a local biologist who had been leading nature treks for more than 10 years. The hikers included 23-year-old Rachel Morton, a recent university graduate traveling solo before starting a new job. With her was Jamie Hunt, 25, an experienced hiker from Manchester who had previously trekked in the Andes and was known for his steady approach in stressful situations. Also in the group were twins, Sarah and Lauren Brooks, both 21, who had been volunteering at a coastal turtle conservation center. Rounding out the group was Tom West, 28, a quiet photographer who carried 2 cameras and extra gear at all times. The hike began calmly. They followed a narrow trail under thick canopy, their headlamps cutting through the haze. Marco pointed out faintly glowing insects and spoke about the forest's unusual climate. The group stayed quiet, careful not to startle any animals. As they moved deeper, the path curved toward a steep section lined with moss and ferns. The air became heavier, colder. Then, an odd noise echoed through the fog, like branches snapping from somewhere above. Marco stopped and raised his hand. The group stood still, holding their breath. Another sound came, closer this time. Deep, deliberate steps echoed in the distance. The usual sounds of the forest faded. They gathered close to Marco, unsure of what was approaching. Tom tried to raise his camera, but the lens clouded from the humidity. As Marco turned to speak, something moved just beyond the edge of their lights. It passed through the trees with unnatural silence, disturbing only the leaves. Then came chaos. A shadow rushed forward and Marco vanished. He was dragged off the trail into the darkness. His scream was cut short and he was never seen again. The rest of the group screamed and ran in different directions, their headlamps shaking wildly. Rachel tripped and fell, scraping her knees. Jamie helped her up, and they stumbled forward together. Sarah and Lauren ran in the opposite direction, holding hands tightly. Tom stayed frozen for a moment, trying to see where Marco had gone, but the fog had closed in again. Only broken branches, strange prints, and scattered gear marked the spot where Marco had stood. The remaining hikers ran for what felt like miles, yelling for help, trying to stay on the path. At last, they saw the glow of a ranger station light between the trees and rushed toward it without stopping. By morning, they were safe inside, but they could barely speak. The 4 remaining hikers collapsed inside the ranger station. They were soaked, trembling, and covered in scrapes from branches and rocks. A ranger tried to ask what had happened, but the group could only point back toward the trees. It took several hours before any of them could speak clearly. When they finally talked, their voices were low and uncertain. They explained how Marco Alvarado had been taken by something they could not identify. They described how he was pulled violently into the forest, his scream ending too quickly. There had been no signs of a struggle afterward, just leaves swaying high above, as if disturbed by something large moving overhead. At dawn, a search team followed the hikers' trail back into the forest. They found broken backpacks, a shattered flashlight, and pieces of torn fabric hanging from the branches. Around the site where Marco had vanished, the ground held large, deep impressions unlike those of any known animal in the region. There were no bloodstains, claw marks, or tooth wounds. What the search team found instead were bent trees and scattered belongings. Heavy movement had flattened plants and knocked over moss-covered logs in a wide path that led off the trail. Some trees had been snapped at odd angles, far higher than a person could reach. The search went on for 2 days. Trained dogs, aerial drones, and thermal gear were brought in. Still, no trace of Marco's body was found. The forest remained quiet, as if whatever had passed through had vanished completely. The rest of the group's camera gear had also disappeared. Rangers told the hikers that a large predator, possibly a jaguar, had attacked in the dark, but none of the group accepted that theory. They knew what jaguars looked like, and none had moved like the thing they had seen. Jaguars do not walk upright, and they do not move without sound. Rachel, Sarah, Lauren, Jamie, and Tom were flown back to San Ramon 2 days later. They each gave formal statements to local authorities. They were advised not to speak to the media, and they followed that advice for the most part. But quiet conversations and private messages hinted at something unnatural. Tom shared a few photographs from earlier in the trip, pictures of birds, insects, and the group smiling along the trail. But none from that night were included. Whatever happened after they entered the deeper section of the forest left no visual record. Wildlife officials issued a report stating the likely cause of the disappearance was a rare animal encounter. But privately, a few members of the search team expressed doubt. Some said the indentations in the soil were too wide. Others noted a strange, oily residue found on snapped branches near the last known location. The section of the trail where Marco vanished was eventually closed to night hikers. Warning signs were placed, citing unstable paths and unpredictable weather. But those who live near Verdontra Cloud Forest tell a different story. They speak of something that moves between the trees, too fast to see, too quiet to hear. Years later, the hikers moved on with their lives, but that they were never quite the same. Rachel no longer traveled alone. Jamie stopped hiking altogether. Tom avoided forests entirely. And Marco Alvarado, the trusted guide, was never found. On June 17, 2018, the Carter family arrived at Deadman Valley, a remote part of British Columbia known for its thick trees and quiet streams. Robert Carter, the father, had always loved nature. He worked as a forest guide in his younger years and wanted his children to experience life outside the city. His wife, Maria, worked as a school librarian and shared his love for the outdoors. Their 2 children, 16-year-old Ethan and 12-year-old Lily, were used to family camping trips, but had never gone this deep into the wild. They set up their tent beside the creek where the sound of flowing water filled the air. Robert taught his kids how to light a fire using dry moss and flint, while Maria cooked simple meals on a small camping stove. The first day passed peacefully. The family took photos, played near the water, and told stories as the sky turned dark. On their second night, Ethan was still awake long after everyone else had gone to sleep. He had brought a small notebook to take notes on nighttime sounds for a school project. Around midnight, he heard something strange, low growling noises that came from the forest just beyond their tent. He quietly wrote down what he heard. The growls continued in a steady rhythm, deep and slow. They didn't sound like any animal he had heard before. Ethan woke his father, who thought it might be a bear. Robert grabbed a flashlight and told his son to stay inside. He quietly stepped outside the tent to look around. The growling had stopped, but there was a strong smell in the air, like wet fur and earth. He walked a few steps toward the edge of the trees, scanning left and right. Suddenly, from behind one of the tall trees, something large moved. It was too dark to see clearly, but Robert felt a sharp burst of pain across his back. A massive figure had swiped at him, leaving long, deep scratches across his shoulder and side. He stumbled backward, shouting for help. Maria rushed out and saw her husband on the ground. Ethan and Lily followed, and the whole family backed into the tent, terrified. They heard heavy footsteps circling them for a few seconds before the sound faded into the trees. Without waiting, they grabbed what little they could carry and ran toward the dirt road where they had parked their car. They drove for miles before stopping at a ranger station. Robert was bleeding badly, and Ethan kept repeating that the creature was not a bear. Robert had been injured during the encounter. His wounds were wide and jagged, not like the narrow claw marks of a black bear. Rangers returned to the campsite the next morning. Most of the gear was left behind, scattered and stepped on. What shocked them were the tracks near the edge of the trees. They weren't paw prints. They were long, wide, and deep, like a person's footprint, but far too big to belong to any human. The Carters had left in fear, but something else had stayed behind in those woods. The ranger team returned with more people the next day. They carefully studied the campsite. The tent was torn at the side, with long rips stretching through the fabric. The campfire had gone out, and some of the food bags were ripped open and tossed across the ground. It looked like something powerful had passed through, not in a hurry, but with control. Beside the torn gear, the footprints stood out the most. They were not like bear tracks. These were long and flat, shaped more like human feet, but nearly twice the size. Some prints had clear toes pressed into the soft earth. The depth showed that whatever left them was very heavy. Rangers took photos and cast molds, unsure what to make of them. Investigators noted Robert's injuries again. His wounds were wide and jagged, unlike any usual animal attack they had seen in the area. The park staff recorded it as a black bear incident for the report, but some quietly admitted it did not match any bear behavior they had studied before. Ethan shared his written notes from the night of the encounter. He had carefully described the growling sounds he heard, deep and slow, almost too deep to belong to a normal animal. He had noted a faint rustling, followed by heavy breathing and distant steps. These details were added to the case file, though they were never made public. The family returned to their home, shaken by what had happened. Robert's wounds took weeks to heal. He needed stitches across his back and side, and doctors warned about possible nerve damage from the deep cuts. Maria stopped going on camping trips completely. She could no longer sleep well unless every door and window in the house was locked. Ethan refused to forget what happened. He reviewed his notes many times, each time trying to find something new, some clue that would explain what they had seen. But the words only brought back fear. His younger sister, Lily, though unharmed, was scared of the dark now and never left her room at night. A few months later, a local trapper visited the same area. He had lived near Deadman Valley for years. When asked about the Carters' story, he said the tracks they described were not from any bear. He said the forest sometimes had visitors that did not belong to any book. They left no sound, only signs. Though no creature was ever found, the park added new safety signs near Deadman Valley. They warned visitors to report any strange behavior, sounds, or tracks. People were advised to stay on marked paths and never camp alone or too far from other group. The Carters never returned to Deadman Valley. What they saw and heard stayed with them. And deep in the woods, beyond the reach of lights and roads, something else might still be watching. Something that moved without sound and vanished before morning. On March 20th, 1999, Declan O'Shea set out alone into the misty ridgelines of the Dunharrow Range, a quiet mountain region known for thick trees and steep paths. Declan was 34 years old and had grown up in Cork. He had always been drawn to nature and silence. After working for years in an office job, he quit to follow his passion for hiking and outdoor travel. He started sharing his hiking journeys through journals and hand-drawn maps, which he later planned to turn into a book. Declan had spent the previous week staying in small lodges and walking the low, forested valleys. He took notes about each location, marked trails on a folded map, and kept his camera and field notebook with him. He was known for being careful, always leaving messages about his routes and expected return dates. That morning, he checked out of a lodge in Kennedy and told the owner he planned to walk a trail toward Glen Barrow. It was a foggy day, and the skies were dull. Locals later said it was unusually quiet that weekend, with fewer birds than normal and very little wind. Declan started recording odd things on the first night of his trip. In his journal, which was found later, he described low thuds echoing through the trees and a feeling that something was following him. He mentioned tree trunks with wide scratches, and once he found a stone cairn that had been knocked over. He wrote that he repaired it out of respect, even though no other hikers had passed him. By the second day, the air was heavy and still. Declan reached a narrow trail near a high ridge overlooking a steep cliff. He wrote about large stones that seemed to have been moved and a strange rhythm in the sounds he kept hearing at night. His final full journal page included the line, "It's watching again." That night, Declan set up a small camp close to a natural overhang. He made a fire and tried to get some rest. The area was known for its thick mist, and the nearby forest grew close around the rocks. He had written about the low growls and breaking twigs he described in his notes. 2 days later, search and rescue teams were sent to look for him after he failed to return or check in. His torn backpack was found near the edge of a ridge, just meters from a steep drop. His journal was nearby, damp but still readable. No signs of a fall or blood were found. However, searchers did find broken branches higher than a person could reach and markings carved deep into tree trunks. Declan O'Shea was never found. A retired Garda officer who spoke to locals and some of the rescue team later said off the record that the prints found near the site were unlike any bear or human. They were wide, deep, and showed signs of something walking upright. Locals in small towns nearby whispered about what might have happened. Some believed it was a bear that had come from the mountains. Others spoke of an old forest legend, something that lived in the deepest parts of the woods. They called it the Silent Watcher, a figure said to appear only in heavy fog, moving between trees and watching from the shadows. By the time the official report came out, the forest trail had been closed. Officials stated the area was unstable due to geological hazards, but no rockfall was ever reported. The story of Declan O'Shea became another quiet tale added to the list of strange things whispered across Ireland's hills. The trail near the ridge remained quiet for days after the search was called off. Rain washed away most of the shallow prints. Only the larger ones, too deep to fade quickly, remained for a while longer, pressed into soft earth near the overhang where Declan had camped. Rangers returned to the area once more, hoping to collect any remaining belongings, but no new evidence was found. The thick fog made the search even harder, and eventually it was stopped altogether. Back in Cork, Declan's family held a private memorial. His mother spoke of how her son always respected nature and how he would never take risks that put him in real danger. She said she believed he had found something in the forest, something no one else was ready to see. Friends described him as careful, honest, and deeply connected to the land. The forest itself seemed to return to normal. The birds sang again. The wind moved through the trees like before. But in towns near the base of the Dunharrow Range, people talked more quietly about hiking. Fewer visitors arrived that summer. Guides changed routes, and local papers ran small warnings about unstable ground and poor visibility near the ridgelines. The official report listed the case as missing, presumed dead. Declan O'Shea was declared dead, though his body was never recovered. The journal pages were never shared with the public, but copies were kept in a sealed file. One of the rescue workers, a young volunteer, said he had read parts of it. He said the final entry had been written with a shaking hand. The handwriting was uneven, with several smudges and deep press marks on the page. It ended with the words already known, but added more lines that seemed to describe what Declan saw. Those words were not included in the final report. A week after the search ended, a retired Garda officer came forward, claiming that something had been hidden. He said investigators had found hair strands near the tree line, long and coarse, darker than any bear or wolf. He also said a single tree had been clawed halfway up its trunk, with splinters spread in a wide circle around the base. His comments were dismissed by higher officials, but rumors started again, stronger than before. Tourists, hikers, and local farmers began hearing strange things again. Rocks being thrown into streams, low footsteps on gravel paths, and even quiet breathing just outside tents at night. These reports were never confirmed, and many were explained as wind or wildlife, but the stories spread fast. A man who lived near the forest edge said he found one of Declan's missing items weeks later, a field guide to Irish birds, lying under a pile of leaves not far from his farm. The pages were damp, but mostly intact. The last marked bird was a raven, circled in red ink. The area where Declan vanished was closed for the rest of the year. A sign was posted warning hikers of unstable cliffs and the risk of sudden fog. No geological survey was ever published. In time, the story of Declan O'Shea became part of the land. Campers still talk about him around fires. Guides remind hikers to mark their routes well. Some carry small bells, others light candles when passing certain points on the trail. They say it is to show respect, not fear, though no one stays overnight near that ridge anymore. And though nothing else has happened since, people who know the story still look twice when they hear branches snap in fog. Not because they expect a bear or a wolf, but because they believe Declan might have been right. It is still watching.